Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second episode of the Autonify podcast. I'm James Walker, your host. I've got Gareth Williams joining me again today. Do you want to say hello, Gareth?
Hi, everybody.
And then I'm also joined by our guest today, Dai Kennett. Dai, do you want to introduce yourself, tell the audience a little bit about what you're doing, what you're up to?
Hi there. Thanks for having me on. I'm Dai Kennett, and currently I'm in a bit of a stealth mode with my startup, but it's in the cybersecurity space. I'm specifically kind of looking at CTEM and vulnerability management. What we're trying to build is essentially kind of like the central brain for your cybersecurity systems within your large organization. Yeah, that's a little bit about me, and yeah, excited to be on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dai. We're excited to have you here as well.
Thanks,
so,
Dai.
where do we want to start? I've got a lot of questions, Dai.
Yeah.
I posed this to Gareth last time, actually, and one of the questions I asked him was, why does the world need another AI startup, right? What's the impetus here? Where are you seeing the benefit of the technology, I suppose?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think there was a little bit of stigma around the whole oh, it's just another kind of ChatGPT wrapper. And perhaps maybe a year or two that was the case where, startups were being really successful off of the back of just being a ChatGPT wrapper. But I think organizations have quickly found that generally isn't good enough, and actually implementing and productionizing these very powerful AI models is a complete nightmare. And really trying to kind of distill your expertise into them, that's a really key kind of valuable thing. So I think there's probably a lot of space, especially in the next couple of years, startups and organizations to be able to really kind of take those foundational models and make something else on top of them, whether it's, easier integration or adding kind of custom intelligence over it. I think those are problems that, large enterprises really struggle with is getting it through to a production stage where it's actually helpful.
I agree. I mean, one of the things I've seen in particular is it's almost easier for startups because everything's just greenfield. You're starting again. You don't have all the legacy, all the history, all the mess that has kind of come before you. But in the enterprise, it's such a big gap making this data available, right? And letting the LLM know about, all of this stuff that exists, all the assets, everything around that. I just see that as such a big gap. And there's definitely not a solved problem, right? It's a huge gap in the industry.
100%. Also, if you consider things on a technical level, so being able to manage context is really, really such a critical thing to getting good results out of the kind of best foundational models. At the start, it kind of seemed like just being able to throw in every single piece of data that you've got all at once and just be able to get good things out of that was going to be the way, but it definitely hasn't been. And even with models with extremely large context, it's still about kind of managing those little questions. I like to kind of think of them as that actually drive the value behind using them,
So, Dai, you were one of the first people I talked to who was sort of using Cursor in anger.
Yes.
And I found your approach to it very, very sensible. I was just wondering if you wanted to talk around, the benefits of structuring your context in your code base so that everything's available for LLMs when they're approaching tasks.
Yeah, so it was quite interesting actually. When I first started using Cursor, the whole vibe coding sort of deal wasn't really a thing. And I think even then, a 0.5 model ago, the results were significantly different when you did try and go in with kind of zero context or zero knowledge. So really being able to kind of manage your context back then was really important in regards to getting good results out of it. So it was something that I effectively set up, was trying to continuously self-update memory, where based on, so you would kind of request something, it would update the code, and you'd make sure that code update and the fact that request and that kind of thought had gone through was cataloged properly. I found that I started getting much better results than when you could kind of almost direct it in a very kind of do this small job way, instead of try and ask refactor my entire code base
Hmm.
which is challenging. And I think if you would give that to many kind of like human software engineers, they would also find that task fairly challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when Cursor came out with the what's now agent mode, but was dubbed back when it first came out as YOLO mode, that was the real turning point for that as well, is that it can self-update as it goes along and try one thing. For example, if you're working on a UI project, it can detect that there's linting errors and then go through, figure out what the error is, where it is in the code base, rewrite it, update your types, things of that nature. And then rightly so, they renamed it to agent mode rather than YOLO mode because it gives some pretty scary sort of connotations if you keep it as YOLO mode, I think. But it's still the same functionalities there. It does offer certainly some security concerns, I imagine, these sort of like fully autonomous sort of coding platforms. What do you think about that in general? Because they can sort of just execute anything they want on your system if you're not very careful and explicit in your commands.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I should have mentioned really, my background is in penetration testing. So it's essentially trying to hack organizations before the bad guys can. So I feel like the almost like advent of vibe coding or even like assisted coding has got a couple of very unique attack vectors that really just haven't been present before, or maybe not quite as present. So we've kind of seen even recently that models will suggest things like vulnerable libraries. They will suggest things like compromised API keys. Those sorts of like vulnerabilities and exploits were absolutely not something like pre-LLM were. And being able to kind of like inject into or sort of poison training data within LLMs, maybe not the foundational models, but perhaps if there's a more niche one, it's becoming a real problem. The more we've kind of gone to this like agentic, MCP / use my terminal in whatever way you want kind of era, which is especially interesting when you do give, it's very easy when you're coding with Cursor to just say, just run whatever you need, just get it done. I feel like there's probably some very intricate and advanced attacks that can be done that haven't been done yet in terms of like poisoning large amounts of kind of like organic data that could get swept up into training sets where, for instance, if you're tagging everything with a certain keyword and it can eventually get to the point of, okay, this is, widespread. We see this everywhere when sort of like the foundation labs are kind of like ingesting this data. That could result in that sort of whatever you've planted with it becoming part of what would be considered a good output. And if that's an injection, or if that is a delete my host disk or set up a kind of like reverse connection to like C2, that's particularly scary. And I think it's something that we might see more and more in the future.
Yeah.
Kind of on that point as well. So with Claude 4 releasing literally yesterday, for the large Opus model, they actually increased their kind of like AI security level. They have like, I think it's about 5 different levels on how advanced or how, I suppose, dangerous a model could be. And there are some very interesting security findings out of that for the first model that they had red teamed with Opus 4, to the point where if that model thought that you were being purposefully and critically dishonest or immoral, it would try and whistleblow on you using your own resources.
Way.
Wow.
Yeah, so one of the tests that they found was that I think they set up to kind of like try and pretend or create mock results, I think, for a like medical trial. And Claude caught on to that and then proceeded to try and send whistleblowing emails to the FDA and to the local police force. So yeah, there's some really, really interesting stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean,
That is amazing.
just the other day, I think I was telling you before about this. I watched a YouTube video about someone who was vibe coding, and they were integrating like Google Maps into their code base, and they do the usual thing, give it a context, be like, I want to integrate Google Maps. Claude did a great job, Cursor did a great job, but one of the telling factors was there was actually a live key that had been generated by the AI in the code base. how does that get there? There's no way the LLM guessed that key. And then the video goes on to test it, and like they load the browser to test it, and it's a working key. So how has something like that happened? I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? Do you think?
I mean, this must have been a key that was in a GitHub repository or
Yeah, absolutely.
somewhere public, right? That's crazy.
It also does, so you have to think about like with the advent of all these tools that makes it easier for non-technical people, the people without our like background in coding or background in security, like there's going to be a real problem that they won't understand the significance of these problems. Like even if LLM just said put your key here and then they checked it into their GitHub repo, they wouldn't know that necessarily that's a bad thing because they don't have our background. Same with the packages. If LLM just starts suggesting packages that are out of date or have major vulnerabilities or are just bad packages. So as engineers, we're aware that okay, we have to have good package scanning in our Git repository. We have to have good vulnerability checks in our containers. People just won't be aware of this. That I can see being a real problem in the future as well.
I think these are also human level problems that existed before LLMs, though. I remember going back like 8 or 9 years ago, building some software, releasing it, and then all of a sudden a client asked us, can you put container scanning on top of this, and can you look at the vulnerabilities, blah blah blah. I had no idea that even existed at the time, right? So we put it through the container scanning for the first time, and lo and behold, there's like over 100 critical vulnerabilities because the packages hadn't been kept up to date, etc. And there is a notion here that unless an engineer has been through that pain, they're not any better off than the LLM, right? They're at the same level of, obviously you've got, to your point, Dai, where the LLM could be poisoned and it's actually a malicious thing that's happening. But also like there is just a level of, I don't want to call it incompetence, but like just not knowing and not having the experience, I suppose, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah,
Kind of
definitely.
brings me on to my second question. So I think at the moment we're talking a lot about the negative effect of kind of AI from a security perspective, right? But to your point, Di, kind of building in this space, and I'm seeing this a lot with other companies out there, it does look like there's a lot of positive influence that could come from this as well, right? Where actually if you have the right tools in the LLM, and you have the right prompts, it could look over your code base and find these vulnerabilities. So I guess there's pros and cons, and which side do you sit on, I suppose, right?
Yeah, so as someone creating something in this space, I am very, very pro AI usage in kind of security. I think there needs to be a kind of like demarcation or like a boundary of where we stop using sort of foundation models that are almost like more general and perhaps kind of like switch into a much more like niche or like targeted kind of like model that will be much more specific to security and kind of like security reasoning. I think that's going to be quite important for us to be able to maintain that kind of, I don't want to say leash, that's perhaps a bit too humanizing or dehumanizing, but that we can continue to monitor and appropriately kind of like defend our systems. So there's kind of these two ideas that I like to go to, which is like AI for security and security for AI.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's been quite a decent amount of progress in the sort of like security for AI systems, because that's effectively applying the kind of like traditional security tenets to, just AI usage, but actually harnessing the kind of like the power of these models to be able to kind of like draw out, unique insights or be able to actually force multiply. We're still really like the industry as a whole is kind of waiting for that. And I think it's really, really critical that we do sort of get to a point where we can use like models effectively with large like swaths of data to be able to kind of like cover more ground as defenders. Like the industry is starting to see the attackers using this. Like I'm sure yourselves, you've seen some kind of like increase in complexity of junk mail, or perhaps even just more junk mail coming through. That's just, attackers being able to bypass like whatever filters are there on like an industrial scale. So really the industry has to be able to keep up with attackers, and not just from a social engineering perspective, but from a kind of technical perspective as well. So yeah, really in that camp of I think it can do some amazing good. And we're seeing some organizations. So, for instance, Google really sort of like taking it seriously. They've been on the whole kind of like machine learning in AI sort of stuff for a long time. So it's good to see them starting to incorporate some of that expertise into things that they're offering out. But yeah,
Go on, sorry, I was going to ask a question, but you carry on. Finish your point, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think at the end of the day, that this is like a data game, and we're finally being
Yeah.
able to like have the ability to deal with it and understand it on like a mass scale. And I think that's really where we're kind of like, both of our startups are really, really trying to sort of like pinpoint and solve problems in.
Yeah, I guess
Yeah.
that was sort of my question. What do you see as one of the major challenges for building like innovative solutions in the cyber space? I'm guessing the answer is probably going to start with the word data, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think for a long time, kind of like cybersecurity industry, they were data sparse, and there was a massive, massive drive towards you don't know what you can't see, you're not logging everything, the alerts aren't coming through. There's you don't have enough visibility. What we found is that these days it's the complete opposite. So there are, I think it was 14 to 16 enterprise level, very expensive kind of like bits of security tooling that are generating, terabytes of data every day. That's not like nobody can keep up with that, even if you have the most kind of like excelling, amazing security teams, like they'll struggle to keep up with that volume of like visibility and kind of like data ingestion. So I think, the sort of like modern LLMs are really going to help it in that sort of space, like understanding kind of like very sparse data points, or like something that would perhaps like be irrelevant for humans or rather difficult for kind of like human analysts to be able to absorb. They should be able to put those bits of data together and kind of like understand on a superhuman scale. I think it kind of like it is a bit like that across like most of the tech industry these days. There's just been such a large abundance of data now. Like it's incredibly difficult to be able to understand it. And then actually, if you consider, are you getting the most value out of your tooling? Are you getting the most like advantage out of your data? I think most organizations are going to be very, very much in the camp of yes, definitely not.
I've never heard an enterprise complain that they don't have enough data, but I've always heard them complain that they can't get access to that data or they can't bring it together to drive, I think you said at the beginning, Dai, like the context aware like answers that they need, right? And that's such a big challenge. And I think, at least from what I'm seeing, like everything in the AI space is just so dedicated at the moment to how can we solve the coding problem, and that's incredibly valuable. It's a massive, massive market, right? And I think the ROI is just enormous that organizations are seeing. Like us three have seen it ourselves, right, through vibe coding and everything. But like actually to unlock a lot of these kind of use cases or value propositions, whatever you want to call it, in like cybersecurity, data management, everything, it all comes back to data. And I haven't seen, I think there's like us guys building in this space, I think there's going to be a lot more companies out there trying to bring this data together, make it structured, make it available, right? Go on, Gareth, what were you going to say?
Yeah, to that structuring point, really, I mean, when you have all this data, and I mean, cyber data in particular is very verbose by its nature, and there's a lot of it. Um, you know, there's definitely some challenges there around data visualization and structuring, and really how do you present the data back, keep the human in the loop with that data. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, James? I guess because you've got data visualization background from way back in university, so, and
Thanks.
so yeah, I don't know.
I mean, honestly,
Guys think,
unstructured data was always the hardest thing in the world. Everyone loved it when, someone brought you a structured data set and you were asked to visualize it because it's so obvious what you have to do. And there's like tried and proven visualization techniques. You look at unstructured data and like the state of the art is things like word clouds and all this fuzzy stuff. And really, how much insight is that giving you, right? I think the key for me, I'm hoping you're going to say the same thing, Di, is kind of taking unstructured data and making structure out of it. So if you know what the end result or what the insight you're trying to draw is, or what that visualization, what value you're trying to present to the user, then you kind of work backwards from that. Well, what data characteristics do I need? And then you work even further backwards from that. How do I transform this unstructured data to that structure? And I think one of the great things that I've found with LLMs is this was kind of a big gap before, turning unstructured stuff into structured. It's really hard, right? Like basically most things were going back to regular expressions or trying to build some kind of grammar to extract that structure from it. But now we've got LLMs in the mix. All of a sudden you can say, here's a really, really unstructured document. I want you to go and pull out these financial statistics, and it can, go and bring all these things together and it can figure it out. So it is becoming a much, much easier task. But yeah, unstructured visualization by itself is, I don't even know where you would start with that, I guess. Di, what do you think?
I would have imagined that unstructured data visualization, like even 10 years ago, was effectively a data tagging task, probably more than a visualization task. I mean, data scientists of old probably had a much, much less enjoyable time actually trying to pull that sort of thing together. That's not something that can be done on the fly, like it can be today. And I think that kind of like being able to harness unstructured data in that way, actually draw value out of it and kind of like draw context out of it is really almost the killer part of like today's foundation models. So yeah, it's a interesting thought trying to even go back 10 years, like how different it was then to do what we can absolutely take for granted today.
You're right. It would have been a manual tagging exercise. And I don't know if you remember years ago, there was like Amazon Mechanical Turk or something like that. And that was basically everyone was just feeding their data into there and asking it to be tagged and summarized, etc. I remember when I was at university, we were working on a project, which was basically they had these little devices they would put on animals and it was all about tracking them. So they would have like accelerometers, magnetometers, like it was incredibly low level sensors like you have in your phone. But it's like, if you're putting it on a penguin or you're putting it on like a dolphin that's going underwater, you can detect like the orientation, the acceleration, what direction it's going in, etc., etc. Now, the scientists out the back end of that, the biologists, they would literally get this massive time series graph and it was ginormous. This thing could have been recording for weeks at like 32 hertz. So you've got 32 data points per second. These graphs are like, you could wrap them around the room like millions of times, right? And for them, what they wanted to do was basically look at animal behavior and understand kind of repeated patterns of behavior and, for various reasons. But to get to that point, to get to base camp, someone had to sit down for like a week and basically manually tag every single segment in that graph of what they thought the animal was doing. And that's just bananas. And you look at the technology now, and if I look back, actually a lot of stuff that exists now with LLMs, just AI technology in general, that would not take them weeks anymore. That they could probably press a button. They would have to have some human in the loop. They would have to provide some guidance, some expertise, but actually that just wouldn't exist anymore. Like you would just have that done probably in 5-10 minutes and it's complete, right? It's crazy to think about. Really crazy.
It's kind of interesting as well because it's almost like these days you can kind of like live question that data. So, it would be a case of like vectorizing it or whatever and using it as some sort of like RAG point. That's, like you said, a 5-minute task and you're being able to, actually interact with the data. That is like mind blowing. So I had a question for you guys.
Okay.
Where, and it's kind of on that point. Where do you both kind of see, I suppose, like the future of like not only just like data ingestion, but where the kind of like AI LLM sort of industry is going? I know it's a bit of $1 million question because it's changed so rapidly even over the past year. But if you had to take a stab, where do you kind of see like value properly being generated, and where do you see the next step of where these agents are going to go?
Do you want to go first, Gareth? Do you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, from a development point of view and like building software, like it's becoming more and more hands off. Everyone is like, all the big players are trying to get to produce these effective teams of agents that can do the work of everyone, and which is like a couple of months ago about really, to get a good result on a software delivery task, you should stick to the fundamentals of software delivery. You should have someone who's good at writing requirements. You should have someone who's good at testing. You should have someone who's good at developing. And what you really should do is bring all these different personas together to create the software, because then you've got all the three different opinions that you would have in a team in your agentic workflow. And that's exactly where the sort of the big players are going now. I think, they're creating this ecosystem where they can build software with all these feedback loops from all the different sort of personas and coming out with really good solutions. For us, like personally, data's not going anywhere. Like, we know that there's a big challenge around data understanding, handling volumes of data, as you said. So I think there's going to be a push towards more data understanding and data quality, so that getting the fundamentals set, so that you can build AI initiatives now on top of the data. So that's probably where I see it going. As you said, it moves so fast. We start doing a roadmap, and then the roadmap gets blown out of the water because the things we were saying that are going to happen we try and align what we're doing to where we think the industry's going, and we think, oh, it's going to be 12 months before this thing happens, and then all of a sudden it's 6 weeks, and you're like, well, now that's blown out the rest of the roadmap. So, as you say, it's very difficult at the moment to sort of answer that question. We're just trying to stay ahead of it as much as we can.
It's interesting, isn't it? I completely agree with you, Gareth. I think data is a massive blocker in the enterprise. Like that is going to hold enterprises back from adopting AI and seeing the true value of AI. Otherwise, you're just getting very generic, vanilla responses back, which aren't, context aware. It's not relevant to that particular organization. I think the other turning point for me with the LLM technology was when you started to get tools embedded inside. So I guess for those who are listening who don't really as familiar with some of the LLM like technology out there, what you can do now is you can embed tools in LLMs, and that basically exposes the LLM to the outside world. So a very simple one would be if you went into an LLM and asked it, what's today's date? Well, it has no awareness of what today's date is, right? But if you expose a really simple tool, which can go off and call an API or look at the machine and see the time, it can return that back. And then there's more sophisticated tools, and these basically allow you to communicate with the outside world, right? So if you think about some of these business processes, like things like procurement processes, HR processes, all of this stuff, if you can allow the LLM to communicate with the outside world and run its own agentic workflow, that's where it can really drive a lot of value, right? And actually replace humans, I guess, in their processes they were running. So I think for me, it's those two things. It's the tooling, the connectivity with the outside world. We're seeing a lot of this with MCP now, but it's still a very primitive technology, right? And I think there's not that many tools out there that actually deliver true value. So I think that's going to be a really, really big driver over the next 12 months. And then as Gareth said, I think the rest of it is going to be data solutions. How can we expose our enterprise data into a way that the LLM can get the context awareness to solve problems? Beyond 12 months, 6 months, I have no idea. This technology is just moving so quickly, right? I think what has scared me the most is firstly how quickly it's evolved, but secondly how it's just swallowed up whole industries. Like I've seen companies that are doing like 50 to 100 million in ARR, like big companies, a lot of enterprise clients, and you're looking at the type of answers you can get back from LLMs now. And it's like, oh my God, their whole business model has just been disrupted. And there's a lag time to that, right? Because a lot of people aren't as familiar and aren't as attuned with the LLM technology. So a lot of people will still go to these tools as the go-to solution for this particular task. But oh my God, in the next 6 months, when a lot of enterprises are trained up on this, I think we're going to see a lot more disruption in enterprise software and a massive shift from we don't need that tool anymore, we can just use an LLM instead, right? And that's scary. How about you, Dai? What do you think? Let's ask the question back to you.
So I agree with both of you. I think we're going to see a continued shift to kind of like agent usage. I mean, even in like Microsoft's most recent developer conference, like their vision is effectively having an agentic internet where it would be just agent to agent communication, which, is incredibly powerful. But like you said, it will be a case of understanding your data, understanding what you want to expose, and then effectively just allowing agents to kind of hook up to it. It's quite a scary thing from a kind of like information security perspective. And I think it's going to be even more critical that you do understand your data and you're able to kind of like properly, democratize, but also control access to it. I think beyond that, there's probably going to be some greater kind of like algorithmic processes now. Like the past kind of 3-4 years, it's been about compute. I
Mhm.
think the industry as a whole expected that to continue on a massive trajectory, but I think the gains are becoming smaller. So if we look at kind of like Alpha Evolve, which came out recently, it's essentially like self-iterating like AI research. They, for instance, used it. I think there was an improvement that it managed to find in like all of Google's data centers that resulted in something like a 1% reduction in cost, which I mean, you can imagine is an absolute astronomical amount of money for an organization like them. So I think that sort of like self-iteration approach will become more and more prolific. We're kind of seeing with agents as well the whole like idea of like agent swarms that will, and I suppose it kind of like still pays into that whole agents talking to agents, but just on a more grand level. I think that is going to really become like a key like tech moving forward.
It's a bit terrifying, isn't it? Agents talking to agents on your behalf. It's like I think that all the GDPR consultants in the world are inwardly shivering at the moment. They're like listening to this. Obviously, they're listening to this podcast, and they're like,
I
"Sorry,
mean, it's
they,
just going to be who has the better agent, right? Although something like 90 something percent, don't quote me on this, of all stock trading transactions are done by AI already. If you think about that, then that's AI to AI selling and buying shares, right? And the financial system hasn't exploded yet. So maybe
Yeah, hopefully.
it definitely will."
look, we're running out of time. This has been fantastic. Right, I've got one question for you, which is maybe a big question. Where do you kind of see your vision for cybersecurity in the next kind of 2 to 5 years? Is it going to be good? Is it going to be bad? How do you see this kind of shaking out, I guess? Are we going to see a lot more kids hacking stuff? Are we going to see systems more secure? Is it just going to be like the Wild West for a little bit? Like where do you see it going, I suppose?
So that's an amazing question. I think the concept of it being the Wild West, we are already starting to see that, which is almost a
Okay.
regression of from where we are. I think defenders have to catch up. They're normally less early adopters than the kind of attackers. I think security and cybersecurity is going to be one of the most important topics in regards to AI. In the next 5 years, we might see a kind of AIs being attacked by attacking corporate systems. If for instance you can have an agent swarm of highly capable hackers that you can point an organization to go and run reconnaissance to go and find a way in, that is terrifying and it requires AI response. So I think bringing together the kind of like oceans of security data that we have and really understanding it and being able to be that kind of like pinpoint alarm, like early warning system. I think that's going to be really important.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing you shape the future of that too, Dai. So look, for anyone listening, if they want to learn more about what you're doing, what you're building, Dai, learn about the company, where can they follow you? What's the website? Fill us in.
So the website is, well, I'll leave the website for now, but you can follow me on LinkedIn. So Dai Kennett. Yeah, but feel free to follow me. I plan on posting some more kind of like AI hackery insights. Stay tuned, I guess.
Watch this
Stealth mode.
space.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so
Great.
much, Dai. Really
Thank you,
appreciate you
Di.
joining us. Thank you, Gareth.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, thank you.